Can everyone hear me? Okay, yes. Yes, I'm getting the nod from the IT team. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kelly Zaney. I am the Senior Vice President of Education and Exhibitions for the Illinois Holocaust Museum. I am honored to welcome you to this evening's Pfeffer Family Forum and to be joined by our distinguished guest, Dr. David Frey, as he shares the remarkable story and his incredible research on Camp Ritchie. Yesterday evening, I had the opportunity to participate as part of a panel discussion at a community forum at Cole-Emmett on combating anti-Semitism. And as part of the discussion, I was able to share the critical work that our museum does every day inside and outside our walls. The work we do to educate not only about the history, but also the lessons of the Holocaust, creating a space for our visitors, whether that's students or teachers, law enforcement, or the general public, to feel that they leave this museum not only with a profound understanding of the past, but that they feel and believe that they have a powerful stake in the present and are empowered to take action in and for their future. That they are needed, are essential to combating anti-Semitism and Holocaust distortion and denial. And this is why in so many ways tonight's program and being with Dr. Frey is so important. Learning about the story of Camp Ritchie, the diversity of the minority groups that it trained, who often were persecuted and ostracized, to keep the importance of this history and the lessons that that teaches us ever facing. And it's also why I must recognize the incredible generosity of the Pfeffer family who are with us this evening. Jeff, Caroline, Ira, Elaine, Stan, Chris, Eric, and Lisa. Years ago, it was your vision to have a forum in which we could gather not only the public, but scholars and authors and the like, not only honoring the memory of the Holocaust, but educating the public in the knowledge that was imparted to serve as a catalyst to honor the legacy of the Holocaust and its connections to today. So thank you on behalf of the staff and volunteers and survivors for your stewardship of this remarkable program. And it's with that it is now my honor to call up an incredible friend, supporter, leader, and member of our board of directors, Jeff Pfeffer.
Good evening, everyone. As you know, my name is Jeffrey Pfeffer, and on behalf of my entire family here tonight, I'm honored to welcome you to the 12th edition of the Pfeffer Family Forum. Tonight's forum is entitled World War II Military Intelligence Training at Camp Ritchie. It is our distinct pleasure to be joined by Dr. David Frey, founding director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the United States Military Academy. I'd like to take a moment and recognize the support of tonight's community partners, Temple Chai, Kol Hadash, Congregation Cole-Emmett, and Japanese American Service Committee. I would also like to recognize my fellow board members, our professional staff, and dedicated volunteers. Thank you for all your support and hard work. We find ourselves at a time in our country when anti-Semitism is being provided a platform, not only by extremists in dark corners of the internet, but also by politicians, celebrities, and influencers. We are also seeing attempts across the country to erase the history and voices of minorities from our children's classrooms. It is therefore timely and essential to learn about the stories such as Camp Ritchie and the diverse minority groups who trained there. The United States has a history of anti-Semitism, racism, and hatred, and that also includes our country's military. The United States Army eventually realized that the individuals that they were marginalizing actually provided tactical and strategic value to defeating Nazism. The Military Intelligence Training Center at Camp Ritchie was created to teach immigrants who arrived prior to World War II, Jewish refugees from Nazism, Japanese Americans recruited straight out of internment camps, and others were trained in battlefield intelligence. Camp Ritchie graduates went on to make exceptional contributions to the war effort, post-war occupation governance, war crime prosecutions, and the creation of the Cold War era world. On behalf of the museum and our family, I hope that you find this evening's program meaningful. Our museum has world-class permanent exhibitions, special visiting exhibitions, education services for students and teachers, and innovative public programming that are available to our community and visitors in person, and as well globally through our virtual museum. Our current special visiting exhibition is Ghost Army, the combat con artists of World War II. The Ghost Army, or the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, had much in common with the work done at Camp Ritchie and played a significant role in saving the lives of Allied service members following the landing at Normandy in June 1944. The Ghost Army operated as a theater troop on the move and had one mission: produce the illusion of Allied troop movement in every place where the Allies were not. The members of the Ghost Army relied on creativity and imagination, and largely consisted of those that the Nazi regime would have targeted: artists and designers who were creative, rule-breaking, strongly individualistic, and members who were Jewish and of the LGBTQ community. With only 1,100 soldiers, this special unit created the illusion of much larger war machine and did so with such success that it helped to secure victory of the Allied powers in Europe. Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center's mission is to inspire our visitors through stories such as those of Camp Ritchie and the Ghost Army. We seek to empower visitors to become upstanders for social justice, to speak out against hatred in all its forms, and to lead by an example. As our motto states, take a stand for humanity. Leading tonight's program on Camp Ritchie is Dr. David Frey, who was recently featured on the long-running and award-winning television news show, 60 Minutes. As part of his work with the Center of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the United States Military Academy at West Point, Dr. Frey has spearheaded efforts to increase awareness, understanding, and efforts to prevent mass atrocity among the military academies, the Army, and the Defense Department. He's the author of Jews, Nazis, and Cinema of Hungary: The Tragedy of Success, 1929 to 1944, and co-author of Ordinary Soldiers, A Study in Law, Ethics, and Leadership. Projects, programs, and products that Dr. Frey has created are utilized by the Department of Defense, the State Department, USAID, the intelligence community, and various combatant commands. It is the work of Dr. Frey and other world-renowned historians that makes our family's commitment to this forum and our museum so important. We must not honor the memory of the Holocaust. We must not only honor the memory of the Holocaust, but also create an ongoing forum that educates the public and serves as a catalyst for continued reflection about the history of the Holocaust and its legacy for today. For it is our museum's mission to honor our survivors, tell their stories, accept the responsibility to protect, cherish, and transmit their precious legacy. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. David Frey.
I heard the story of this wonderful carpet earlier today. It's really nice to walk on it. Excuse me while I pull things up here. So Jeff did such a nice job summarizing the things that I'm going to say. I'm not sure I actually need to say them. I want to thank him and the entire Pfeffer family for giving me this privilege to talk to you tonight. A special thanks also to Kelly Zaney and her team here, to Raheem, to Matt, Leah, Meredith. All of you have been very patient with me and extremely helpful. And it really is an honor for me to be here. And this, in a way, is kind of a homecoming for me. I lived in Ingleside, which little ways west of here, from ages 4 through 8. So if any of you are actually trying to do some quick calculations, that was about 20 years ago. So a quick disclaimer. The views that you are about to hear are my own. They do not necessarily reflect those of any policies or positions of the U.S. Military Academy, the Department of the Army, the Department of Defense, or any other U.S. government agency. I am, of course, obliged to say that, and probably is a good idea. So I'm going to discuss the World War II Military Intelligence Training Center, known as Camp Ritchie. My concentration is on what I'll call marginal soldiers, recent immigrants, Blacks, Jews, Jewish refugees, especially from Hitler, Japanese Americans, Native Americans. And I was pleased to hear that one of the sponsors was a Japanese American organization. Now, embedded in my aims are to show how World War II era prejudice and genocide are not really tangential phenomena, but are integral to the Army and to military intelligence history. I'll show how Camp Ritchie actually did establish diversity as a tactical, operational, strategic, and hopefully American value. Now, West Point is about organization, so I'm going to give you a little organizational slide. My agenda. So first, I'm going to cover the history of prejudice in the United States Army, American society, and the Military Intelligence Division, specifically in the period between World War I and World War II. Second, I'll bring us to Camp Ritchie and provide you with an overview of the training and activities of those who became known as the Ritchie Boys. In doing so, I will introduce you to some of the groups who populated the camp, which we've already mentioned, and including some of the military instructors there. And in this process, I'll discuss some of the underlying racism that permeated the camp and introduce you to those who confronted it. Third, I'll discuss a Japanese American soldier whose work at Camp Ritchie helped turn the tide in the Pacific. Fourth, I'll briefly highlight contributions made by a handful of renowned Camp Ritchie graduates. Fifth, I'll introduce you to a specific individual whose service and experience was emblematic of Jewish refugee Ritchie Boys. And finally, I'll draw some conclusions. Actually, I'll draw a lot of conclusions, so be warned. So I begin with the basic premise that Jeff already mentioned, that diversity was not considered an inherent good by most Americans in the early part of the 20th century and leading all the way up to World War II. Leading thinkers in the late 1800s and early 1900s included racists and eugenicists like those you see here. They argued there were fundamental differences, physical and intellectual, that were traceable to genetic origins of so-called races. These men even argued that within races, there were inherent inequalities that could not be overcome by education or socialization. They thus believed in segregation and opposed any sort of race mixing. Several argued that overpopulation and resource competition made war natural and that, quote, only the fittest races would survive. Several also advocated what we call negative eugenics, meaning they endorsed actions to prevent the births of certain groups, including forced sterilization and abortion. And these were not marginal thinkers. These were mainstream graduates of or professors at some of our country's and the world's top universities whose ideas had great currency in turn of century America. Now, some of these individuals influenced or were in correspondence with like-minded figures in the US Army and at West Point. You see here a few of those who either identified as racial scientists or endorsed concepts of group superiority and inferiority. I'll note that General Churchill was directly involved in the creation of the Military Intelligence Division. The work of Army Dr. Charles Woodruff, a frequent speaker at the War College and the Military Academy, must have carried weight, particularly when he made remarks like this. And for those of you who are online, I will read this to you. The Jew, then, is a typical illustration of a commensal race, welcomed as long as he renders a returning benefit, but driven out or killed off as soon as he becomes so numerous that he is a harmful parasite and a national disease. European nations have repeatedly undergone a process of disinfection in this regard. The same law applies to the Jew as applies to a bacillus or any other organism, which may be beneficial if few and in place, but deadly if numerous and out of place. Just as soon as he becomes so numerous as to be an economic disease, he is eradicated. The persecution of the Jew, then, is and always has been a natural law because it is necessary for the survival of the supporting organism. It is not persecution of the Jew as Jew, but an extermination of an invading disease. Now, suffice it to say, these ideas helped shape the thinking of War Department leaders. As multiple scholars have pointed out, these ideas arose in the Gilded Age and during the eugenics movement, and were a result that were particularly popular, between the Spanish-American War and World War I, precisely when the American Army began its transformation into an expeditionary one. That era was also when those who became generals in World War II, especially including the famous West Point class of 1915, which produced Eisenhower, Bradley, and 57 other general officers, were being educated at West Point. Through the late 1930s, prominent racists and eugenicists like Fairchild and Lothrop Stoddard, who you saw pictured earlier, lectured regularly on biological racism at the Army and Navy war colleges. The theories that they and a portion of the Army's leadership, which was almost entirely male, white, Protestant, and middle upper class, shared, resulted in many officers espousing quite a myopic view of what being American actually meant. Their ideas of citizenship and belonging were unlikely to have extended to some of us in the room or listening today. I'll give you a specific example. In a 1920 letter to a colleague, Colonel William McCain, then the head of military intelligence, wrote, quote, "The trouble is, the master race is on the decline and gradually ceasing to be master in his own house. It is being swamped by mongrels, greasers, whelps, and hounds," unquote. McCain's fear was very specific, that the white Nordic Protestant, quote, true Americans, unquote, were losing control of something that they rightfully possessed by dint of, quote, conquest, merit, heritage, and even divine providence. But it would be unfair, as Jeff already suggested, just to critique the Army. The period between World War II and World War I and World War II was one of deep prejudice. Americans were disillusioned, in a broad sense, with internationalism. America entered during this period the Red Scare, fearing Bolshevik revolution. And there was a conflation of Jews and communism, with anti-communists labeling Polish and Russian Jewish immigrants as the carriers of communism. It's important to note that this was also the period when Jim Crow laws continued to proliferate throughout the South, when the KKK and other militias saw a substantial revival nationwide, when laws replacing or restricting Japanese land ownership in California tightened, when calls to cut off Mexican immigration grew. Henry Ford, we have to remember, published hundreds of thousands of copies of what was essentially a reproduction of the infamous Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And social discrimination against Catholics and Jews increased. Even in the late 1930s and early 1940s, racism, anti-Semitism, and even anti-Catholicism pervaded the highest ranks of the Army in America generally. In a public opinion poll in 1938, 60% of Americans expressed negative opinions of Jews, finding them, quote, greedy, dishonest, and aggressive. Militias like the Christian Front, whom FBI investigations showed were actually recruiting among the Army, called on its members to, quote, liquidate the Jews in America, unquote. Rallies that included members of the Protestant war veterans and the German Bund often ended with Nazi salutes. And some polls found that anti-Black and anti-Semitic attitudes actually got worse once the war started and as it began, or as it continued, excuse me. And at the highest levels of the War and Navy departments, there remained this fear that full integration would, quote, lower or destroy the morale of the white fighting forces, unquote. So this is the background against which we must understand the Military Intelligence Division. This small insular organization's members shared those other widespread American, well, I'll call them values: racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and especially anti-Bolshevism. Now, what was the job of this small department? Its purpose was mainly to oversee military attachés, although it was involved in the collection of some intelligence on domestic threats in the United States, at least until the mid-20s. In the early 20s, members of the MID, the Military Intelligence Division, issued reports opposing Jewish immigration, reports which strengthened anti-immigrant positions of the Army and Congress. These ideas persisted among some, though it's important to say not all, members of the Military Intelligence Division into the 1930s. In 1932, the MID chief in New York labeled Jews as, quote, a veritable cesspool of undigestible foreign elements, unquote. The father of US military intelligence, Ralph von Damon, remained one of the key voices urging, in the 1930s, urging America to keep Jewish refugees out. And General George Van Horn Mosley, whose quote I'll show you momentarily, one of America's most well-known and controversial pre-World War II generals, he was the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army, told a meeting of reserve officers that because hereditary degeneracy was undermining the gene pool, the, quote, only way we could protect our future should America decide to let Jews in was to sterilize them first. In June 1939, he told the Dease Committee, the precursor of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, that a Jewish conspiracy was about to take over the United States government. And in 1942, he wrote to former President Hoover, saying what you see here on the screen. Now, some of Mosley's fantasies were not inconsequential. When the war broke out, the Military Intelligence Division chief at the time, Brigadier General Sherman Miles, used his position to raise alarm about German Jewish refugees serving as a fifth column in the United States. And what these attitudes and actions do is to help explain why Congress, the president, and the army interned Japanese Americans in concentration camps, refused to desegregate the army even as they searched for manpower in the early years of the war, and initially categorized all Jewish refugees as enemy aliens. This didn't change until March of 1942, when Congress passed the Second War Powers Act. So given these laws, norms, and customs, how did we ever get to a Camp Ritchie, run by that same Military Intelligence Division, which recruited heavily among Jews, immigrants of all type, and even Blacks, Native Americans, women, and Japanese Americans? How did we get to a camp where, as multiple graduates put it, no one spoke English? Well, there are two individuals who play a significant role: General George Marshall and Brigadier General Raymond Lee, the former defense attaché to Great Britain. Marshall realized that the US was at a huge disadvantage in terms of military intelligence. In fact, we had no organized method of training individuals to collect and analyze battlefield information. He then recognized something that seems obvious to many of us today, that those familiar with the languages, the cultures, the terrain of the enemies could actually be extremely useful. Raymond Lee was perhaps the most important figure in this story. After returning from Great Britain, Lee joined the General Staff, and on 1 February 1942, he became the Assistant Chief of Staff of the G2, the intelligence component of the General Staff. And in this position, he assumed supervision of the Military Intelligence Division, replacing the immigrant-fearing Sherman Miles. He had been impressed by the British field intelligence model, and thus he convinced the general staff to build America's battlefield intelligence capacity through the creation of the Military Intelligence Training Center, or MTIC, I'll say, in April of 1942. Lee and the general staff then selected Fort Ritchie in Western Maryland and appointed then Colonel Charles Banfield as commandant. You see him pictured here as a brigadier general, but you also see an aerial photograph of the central part of the camp that he commanded. The camp officially opened in June of 1942, excuse me, and it graduated its first class of officers in the following months. Now, who was it that the Army chose to enter these gates? Recent immigrants, academics, and Americans who had lived abroad were recruited, particularly those who had significant language abilities and scored highly on Army intelligence tests. European Jewish refugees made up a significant number of those selected to attend. By some accounts, up to 17% of the graduates, even though Jews at the time made up less than 1% of the US population. The MTIC was not just populated by German-speaking Jews, however. There were speakers of over 30 languages, including Greek, Italian, Bosnian, Croatian, Hungarian, Polish, French, Czechoslovak, Lithuanian, Russian, Arabic, Armenian, multiple Native American languages. The camp was a literal Babel. The camp included a contingent of the Women's Army Corps, a small unit of African American soldiers, a larger element of Native American soldiers, and one of the first graduates in the first class, Leroy Woodson, was an African American. In September 1944, the camp began training Japanese Americans, a point to which I'll return. To give you a sense of the uniqueness of the camp, I want to read you a snippet of a poem written by Ritchie boy Paul Fairbrook. I'm going to have to turn around to do this. Oh, sorry, I first want to show you a classroom. So your seats are much more comfortable. So was you ever at Camp Ritchie, der very schönste Platz of all, where the sun comes up like Donner mit recorded bugle call, where the GI boots are polished by the majors every night, where lieutenants march in column every day before it's light, where the privates are professors and the corporals write the books, and the PFCs scare captains with their supercilious looks, where the sergeants all talk Hochdeutsch, Hindustani, Greek, Czech, or Greek, and they all are intellectuals in whatever tongue they speak. I think this gives a sense of the uniqueness of who was selected. The counts differ, but it's safe to say that the majority of those who were selected for Camp Ritchie were either foreign-born or were American-born and had spent significant time abroad. And of course, they were especially intelligent. So how were they selected? Some were recruited, others volunteered, and some even claimed to have walked into the Pentagon and demanded to be transferred. Anyone who's been in the Army has to know that that may not be the case. But most, however, were simply pulled from their units, sent to Camp Ritchie with little or no warning and very little information. They were, as soldiers like to say, voluntold. So what did they study? Of course, they studied an enormous amount. A typical course of study was 8 weeks, including 272 class hours and many, many more hours in the field. Most of the attendees had already undergone basic training before arriving at Camp Ritchie, but they did do some combat training, including hand-to-hand and close combat training. They did signals intelligence, including learning, well, sorry, I'm one slide behind, including Morse code and some basic encryption. They learned basic staff duties of their own army. They did translation and interpretation. They learned counterintelligence. In fact, before moving to Fort Hallberg, the Counterintelligence Corps located itself at Camp Ritchie. And as I will later hint, many of the military intelligence personnel at the end of the war, once the fighting ended, transferred into counterintelligence as they continued to track Nazis and Nazi sympathizers. They studied terrain analysis. This is actually a slide developed at Camp Ritchie. They did photo reconnaissance and aerial photography analysis. They learned to spot enemies using equipment like this, staring into stereoscopes until they saw something odd. If you can imagine what this is like, you just go blurry, and they hope that in the process they saw something unusual. They learned enemy army analysis and order of battle. I'll explain the importance of this momentarily. What they most studied, the largest element of training, was prisoner of war interrogation. Incidentally, it's important to mention that they taught the Geneva Conventions and that they should never use violence in interrogation. They learned in artificial villages, often from the permanent force known as the Composite School Unit, which was made up of a significant number of Native Americans. That force we would today call the OPFOR or the opposition force, was especially outfitted with captured German equipment, like what you see here, that was shipped to Camp Ritchie for study and analysis. They attended fake Nazi rallies to understand the psychology of Nazism, leading to some, I'd say, dissonant situations where Jews sometimes took on the uncomfortable role of dressing up as Nazis. Some received specialized language training, during which they would learn and develop, for example, guides to German military slang, such as that you see pictured here. That was just one example. Now, outside of interrogation, perhaps the most important training that they received was to learn the structure and organization of enemy armies, the German army in particular. And the army had an order of battle branch, but it did not have the capacity to produce what the general staff felt it needed. Thus, Camp Ritchie eventually both spawned and populated something called the MIRS, or the Military Intelligence Research Service. The MIRS had two branches, one in London and one just south of DC in a secret location. Both were stocked with men and even a few women who trained at Ritchie. Now, MIRS produced what were called order of battle books. You see an example here. These books detailed the organization, leadership, experience, armaments, training, and many other elements of the German army, the SS and the Nazi Party, as well as the armies of other Axis powers, and we even created some of these on Allied powers. Now, order of battle is incredibly important. It makes an enormous difference to commanders if they know what they are up against when they engage an enemy force. You want to know the unit, how it is equipped, what it has in reserve, how it is organized, how well it has performed in the past. Knowing all of this is critical to adapting your tactics to hit the weak spots in the enemy force. Additionally, these books provided incredibly useful knowledge for battlefield interrogators. They could use the knowledge from of order of battle in order to convince POWs that they already knew the important information, and that whatever the POW were to give up, that was probably something that was already known and of no importance. And that's how they built even greater knowledge. Certain Ritchie boys, by the way, were expected to memorize these entire books detailing the German order of battle, books that eventually by the end of the war neared 400 pages. So as I mentioned earlier, all of this was done in an 8-week course, or at least the introduction of this was done in an 8-week course. Following an 8-day week of 7 days on, 1 day off. In May, Ritchie boy Ralph Hockley spoke to an event with Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff, and he explained the 8-day week as follows. Brigadier General Banfield did not like God's week. He believed God had gotten it wrong, and so he extended the week by a day with only 1 day of rest, and the soldiers sarcastically referred to that day as Bond Day. Okay. So if they were able to survive this Ritchie schedule and the intensive 8 weeks of study, which only about 75% of those who attended the camp did, they received their certificate like one you see behind me. They often went on to another 4-week or longer specialized course in which they focused on one of the aforementioned specialties. Some would become order of battle specialists. Others might have do other advanced study. They might be sent to do practical work in US POW camps to practice interrogation. Others would focus on signal intelligence or photo analysis. That we needed specialists in all of those areas. Some were sent to a subcamp nearby in Gettysburg called Camp Sharp, where they developed and learned psychological operations, particularly methods to encourage German fighters and units to surrender. And if they were exceptional, long course graduates were kept on as instructors. These were known as the Section Fivers. These men and women, who referred to themselves as Ritchie'ites or Ritchiettes, taught for multiple months, but then were often deployed themselves, where in some cases, they then became subordinates to the officers that they had trained. So Nellie Singer, a German Jewish refugee, for example, taught German translation at Camp Ritchie before becoming the chief translator of the war crimes group in Wiesbaden, Germany, once the fighting had ended. Larry Pavey was deployed as part of an interrogation team to help establish the before returning to help establish the intelligence school at Fort Riley after the war had ended. And then he returned to Europe to do more war crimes work. At the intelligence school, he was joined by Julius Gassner, who, having become a colonel less than 5 years after having been commissioned as a lieutenant, also taught at the intelligence school and claimed that the men of Camp Ritchie essentially established that school. Lieutenant Colonel Siegfried Gronich, a Czechoslovak Jewish refugee, not only instructed, but was put in charge of the creation of the Pacific Military Intelligence Research Service, or PACMIRS. He was joined in that work by Madeline Alexander, Ellen Kaufman, Sugi Hurt, who happened to be a Nisei member of the WAC detachment stationed at Camp Ritchie, which was commanded by Ruth Bradley, who you see here. Now, before I go any further, I'll quickly explain how individuals like Sugi Hurt and research groups like PACMIRS actually came to be located at Camp Ritchie. In mid-1944, the Army realized it needed to pivot and train more language specialists for the purpose of waging war and peace in the Pacific. Until that point, similar training, or like what had happened at Camp Ritchie, had occurred at the Military Intelligence Service Language School. However, as American forces advanced in the Pacific, they began capturing millions of documents. So we needed translation capacity. Japanese soldiers began training at Camp Ritchie in September 1944, and Gronich, who had played an instrumental part in setting up the MIRS, now was tasked to create PACMIRS, which became a joint Canadian, US, British, Australian research group whose purpose was translation and creation of order of battle books and specialized reports on Japanese forces. As many are familiar, Japanese families, most of whom were concentrated on the West Coast, were stripped of their homes, businesses, and belongings and deported to internment camps in 1942. They were forced to live in decrepit conditions in which some had to fashion their own beds, like those sent to Manzanar, and to live in fear of their own neighbors, who created hunting licenses like those that you see pictured behind me. Most Japanese Americans lived in fear and isolation. And despite all sorts of disincentives, prejudices, and impediments, Japanese Americans who were forbidden to join the Navy did volunteer for the Army. Segregated Nisei, or the Nisei were the second generation, those born in the United States. Nisei regiments fought heroically in Italy and across Europe. One of these, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in US military history. Other Japanese Americans, including veterans of the 442nd, volunteered or were chosen to attend the Military Intelligence Training Center at Camp Ritchie. Now, the situation for Japanese Americans was different than that experienced by the first classes at Camp Ritchie. Most Japanese American soldiers arrived after September 1944, and unlike in the European theater, the training of Japanese Americans was not primarily focused on interrogation. There are many reasons for this. I'll mention a couple. First, there were far fewer POWs in the Pacific theater, compounded first by kind of racist assumptions about Japanese soldiers fighting to the death, and secondly, because the American-born children of what we call the Issei, the first generation of Japanese migrants, who were not allowed to become citizens, their children were not allowed to actually be in combat in the Pacific theater. They only were allowed to be in support roles. Thus, the primary role, as I mentioned earlier, for the Nisei who were chained at Camp Ritchie was translation of documents. Of course, not all Nisei, particularly the men, felt included, even though individuals like Sigi Hurt remarked that it was service at Camp Ritchie that actually made her feel an equal American. But for many Japanese American men, that wasn't the case. There were exercises in which Japanese Americans were actually forced, as you see in this slide, to pretend to be the enemy, creating an awkward dynamic in which many Nisei found humiliating and indicative of the Army's mistrust and enduring racism. They didn't sit and just take this. In one public protest led by a veteran of the renowned 442nd, they refused to actually play this role. They said, use the normal opposition force. Why are you asking us to actually be playing the enemy just because we may look similar? That was not the only sign of overt racism. The materials that Camp Ritchie produced itself for use in courses to teach how to recognize Japanese uniforms also shows some of the inherent racism. You see, here's one example. Perhaps it's more clear here. Now, in addition to Sugi Hurt, the aforementioned Japanese WAC, individuals like Kazuo Yamane, a graduate of the Military Intelligence Service Language School at Camp Savage, Minnesota, was emblematic of those who joined the PACMERs. Yamane was born in Hawaii and was a member of the Army prior to the outbreak of war. He had worked at the Pentagon on Japanese order of battle and was one of the first Nisei assigned to Camp Ritchie when the PACMERs was established there. He discovered amongst the tons of documents that were delivered to him, they were literal tons, in crates that were labeled no military significance, mind you, critical information about Japanese munition stocks and procurement programs. This led directly to bombing raids targeting the stockpiles and producers Yamane discovered, not to mention allowing US forces to locate and secure weapons caches when occupying Japan at war's end. Now, while Jewish refugees may have felt included and were empowered to contribute, Japanese Americans may have felt somewhat included, but were only partially empowered. Inclusion and empowerment generally did not extend to Native Americans or African Americans. Both groups had segregated quarters. African Americans were regularly assigned duties requiring strength and stamina, conforming to stereotypes white officers frequently held of them. Like in the rest of the Army, African Americans were primarily used as transporters, moving arms and equipment around the camp. Renowned baritone William Warfield was one of the permanent staff at Camp Ritchie, and as a sergeant was charged with overseeing theater and recreational facilities. This again conformed to white stereotypes about Blacks as entertainers. And despite his knowledge of 3 European languages, he was never deployed and only his singing talents were ever utilized. Daniel T. Skinner, commissioned as a lieutenant, had a similar fate. He could only serve as a driver and translator on the Western Front because as a Black, Army regulations prevented him from commanding white soldiers, so he could not serve as the head of an interrogations team. So Skinner, who went on to be a professor of Romance languages at Morgan State for over 3 decades, his capacity was wasted because of the Army's racist structure. Summarizing this racial hierarchy, Ann Schenderlein points out that what became obvious to many Jews at Camp Ritchie was that anti-Semitism was not unusual in the US Army, but segregation also taught those Jewish refugees another lesson, that while they might not have been treated as equals, whatever animosity they might have, at least they were still white. So in addition to the aforementioned anecdotes, what else did the graduates with all of this specialized training provided at the MTech do? As Jeff hinted, many went on to make critical contributions both to the success of the Allied war effort and then after the war in the construction of the post-war world. Now, I'd like to return primarily to the Jewish American graduates of Ritchie. Many of the individuals I'm about to show you emigrated in the 1930s and fought against the Nazi army that exterminated members of their extended families. Ritchie boys were gathering intelligence even before American troops were in the fight. As early as the fall of 1942, they were used to interrogate captured Germans, often submariners, and their reports might look like this, one of which was then pulled out, information was pulled out from this and used to construct the order of battle books. And prior to the invasion of Italy and to D-Day, Ritchie boys worked behind the lines with Belgian, Dutch, French, and other underground resistance organizations. Once they were shipped over, they taught techniques of battlefield intelligence to other officers or other soldiers throughout the army, especially in the lead up to D-Day. Here you see D-Day, excuse me. Here you see them demonstrating German weapons and uniforms. And once the US Army took to the field, Ritchie boys were everywhere. They served in North Africa, then fought up through the lands of their birth, Italy, France, and eventually Germany. Here you see the thoughts of First Lieutenant Walter Rothschild, who served as a liaison to the Free French and then as an intelligence officer in the headquarters of the 7th Army, where he regularly briefed, in fact, twice a day, briefed some of the leading generals in the war, General Patch, General Devers, etc. So I'll give you a little time to read this, but for those online, I'm going to read just the part that's in green. I can't describe, he says in writing from Grenoble, France, I can't describe how an old war Jew came to me gesturing, crying like a baby, kissing me and hugging me. This office is full of French partisans, French officers, Americans that have come back from behind the lines. This, dear ones, is truly the war of liberation, the likes of which the world has never seen. It is as if we were the Messiah, and I believe we are. Here you see Lawrence Kane, who trained to go beyond the front lines as a reconnaissance scout in some of the bloodiest battles of the Army's history. Pictured here are Camp Ritchie produced IPW teams, like those, and all of which contained multiple Jewish refugees from Hitler's Europe. These were the individuals who gathered that information that was critical, that could often be put to use within minutes of its development, and in other cases was pushed up to higher levels to produce sometimes strategic intelligence products. Others were psychological operations specialists. They also went to the front, sometimes in talking tanks, like you see pictured in front of you. Other times, as you see them loading artillery shells with safe passage, safe conduct, surrender passes, but they would go to the front, directly to the front, often within a couple hundred yards, and call on the enemy to surrender. Now, the Army's official history, an unscientific survey of battalion commanders, credits the Ritchie boys with producing over 60% of actionable intelligence on the Western Front. We know that the Ritchie boys' Ritchie intelligence allowed the Third Army to cross the Rhine with almost no losses. They, in fact, predicted the Battle of the Bulge. Ritchie boys discovered details about German rocket programs and allowed us to destroy stocks and capture, or at least produce the surrender of certain rocketeers. Ritchie graduates convinced hundreds of thousands to surrender, saving untold lives. For example, Ritchie boy Ernst Kaufmann took a gamble and got an entire city. The city of Einbeck, more or less a city of, at the time, it was normally about 16,000, but it swelled to about double that number. The whole city and the German command in that city surrendered to him. Nearly 150,000 German troops surrendered to Manny Steinfeld, also a Ritchie boy, who was a member of the 82nd Airborne at the Elbe. They surrendered just before the army linked up with the Red Army. Others served stateside, interrogating and monitoring high-value prisoners at secret sites like Fort Hunt, pictured here. You see the wall is removed there, but that was a big listening device. Beyond the war, some made exceptional contributions as interrogators or translators in the occupation government and at Nuremberg and the subsequent trials. A significant portion of what we learned about genocide crimes originated in work started by Ritchie-trained personnel. An enormous amount of this intelligence was gathered by Jewish refugees who barely more than 3 years prior were considered enemy aliens. And as I said earlier, they are part of the Army's and our nation's history. Now, before I move on, I'm going to move on to conclusions. I'm going to tell you about a single individual. Sorry, I confused that. I'm not going to tell you about the individual yet. I'm first going to tell you about a bunch of others. So these are some individuals who graduated from Camp Ritchie and whose names you might recognize. Many of these contributed to shaping the political, cultural, and intellectual life of post-war America, in addition to some of those I've already mentioned. Many went on to incredible careers and helped shape the post-war world. Among them were bankers like David Rockefeller, philanthropists, cultural innovators, ambassadors, college presidents, civil servants, spies, academics of all types, Hollywood executives, and more. So Ralph Baer, a German Jewish immigrant, became the father of computer games, creating Atari Pong. Eugene Fodor, a Jewish Hungarian-born emigre, is probably familiar to many of you for his Fodor travel guides. Hans Habe, Stefan Heim, Klaus Mann, Max Diemont were all Ritchie boys and all produced world-famous novels and historical works. Heim, in fact, has some Chicago links, having come here as a scholar to the University of Chicago. Academics like Robert Goheen, born in India, became president of Princeton, and he was not the only college president among the Ritchie boys. There were several, and there were also scores of academics. These included physicists like Henry Kolm, you see pictured here, historians like Clemens von Klemperer or Arno Mayer, sociologists like John Kautsky, philosophers, psychologists, political scientists, linguists, legal scholars, and more. Ritchie boy Eric Pleshko went on to run United Artists and Orion Pictures, and he was one of several who played a substantial role in producing America's post-war culture industry. Camp Ritchie also produced future editors of the New York Times, the New Yorker, and newspapers across the country, not to mention publishers like Schocken Publishers. Some served as ambassadors. You see Richard Shifter pictured here. He was one of several. One became a governor, another became a congressman, and many were crucial to establishing America's response in the early Cold War. George Chuchka, who you see now, hopefully you see, helped create Voice of America and America House. Several hundred served in the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, and a number played key roles both in founding the CIA and in founding the NSA and other parts of the Cold War American government. And this is just a sampling of the amazing men and women, a few women who graduated from the MTech. Now I'd like to tell you an individual story, and it will make sense momentarily. Sir Ernst Levestein was born in Frankfurt in 1911, and he came to the United States and eventually settled here in Chicago in the summer of 1940. His father had passed away in 1935, and his older sister had married and emigrated to Providence, Rhode Island. leaving only his mother, Henrietta, in Frankfurt. Levestein changed his name to Ernest Steen, naturalized as a US citizen while training at Camp Ritchie in July 1943. And he's a fascinating example of the individuals who passed through Camp Ritchie. After graduating from technical school in 1930, Steen began work as a shoe salesman in Frankfurt for R&W Nathan, a shoe manufacturer. He was retained there for his technical expertise in 1937 through 38, the beginning of 38 at least, after Aryanization of the shoe company, despite his Jewish background. But his employment was terminated sometime, I'm not sure when, in 1938. While others were being arrested during the November pogrom that we know as Kristallnacht, he was forewarned and he ran away and crisscrossed the countryside for 3 weeks, hiding in an unrelated with an unrelated family in a small village outside Bremen, before returning home by foot to his family. With the help of a friend in London, Steen fled to Britain in March of 1939. And while there, he worked for the Jewish Refugee Committee until getting a visa to the United States and emigrating in May 1940. While in London, he lived in the famed Bloomsbury House, the headquarters of the Jewish Refugee Committee. This building eventually housed some 30 relief agencies serving refugees from all over Europe. And there he worked in something called the Card Room, the nerve center of the Refugee Committee's rescue efforts, where some 60 to 80,000 cards existed containing information on Jewish refugees in the UK and the support they needed or were requesting. Ernest not only helped, I knew that this is the first time I'm actually trying to do this on an iPad. I knew I could not make it all the way through without a little bit of an error. There we go, back to where I was. So he not only helped Jewish emigres, but he and his young colleagues, remember these are all individuals who are in their young 20s, created newspapers, plays, satires, and other entertainment to help themselves deal with the cultural dislocation that they were experiencing. And I'll give you an example of the black humor that they developed. This is a joke that he wrote in one of the, or that one of them wrote in one of their newsletters. So a refugee goes to a fruit stand and the fruitier asks the refugee what he wants. The refugee says, oranges. And the fruitier responds, for juice? And the refugee mutters, such an anti-Semite. So this is the kind of way they dealt with the hand that they had been dealt, the terrible hand. But it also appears that Steen was not only able to help with this production of these kinds of things to help people get by, but he was also able to get some of his co-workers from the shoe factory in Frankfurt out and to London based on some of his post-war correspondence. In May of 1940, he, as I said, emigrated to Chicago, aided by his friendship with Carl Nathan, who now lived in Chicago. Nathan was a member of the family, the R&W Nathan shoe family, which had employed Steen in Frankfurt. And between 1940 and 42, Steen worked multiple jobs in shoe sales and continued working to attempt to extricate his mother from Germany. Ernst and his mother corresponded regularly, and he kept her letters, though sadly his responses have disappeared. This must have occurred at incredible and unimaginable emotional and psychological cost. In late 1940, he wrote a friend who had left Germany much earlier in 1934 that his life would be much easier if he were a soldier, even an immigrant soldier, consigned to do behind the lines work and without a gun, as he had a family obligation to save his mother. Unfortunately, his mother, Henny, was deported from Frankfurt to Łódź on 19 October 1941, and you see the deportation record here. She perished in the ghetto hospital on 8 February 1942. And then less than a year later, likely unaware of his mother's fate, Ernest did become a soldier. He was drafted. He trained as an infantryman and then as a clerk, and eventually was selected to attend Camp Ritchie. He graduated from the 9th Military Intelligence Course in August 1943 as an interpreter with a specialty in interrogation. He was promoted from private first class to technical sergeant. Now there's a gap in his record, but he was sent to Britain around D-Day, and in August 1944, he landed in France as a member of the 80th Infantry Division. Incorporated into the 5th Army Corps, the 80th's first engagement was to successfully fight off German armored counterattacks against Patton's Third Army stretched supply lines. From there, the 80th moved west, fighting at the Battle of the Bulge, moving it through Luxembourg, and eventually arriving in northern Germany. In the process, Technical Sergeant Steen earned the Bronze Star for Valor as well as the Purple Heart when he was wounded in action in March 1945. Along the way, the 80th captured prisoners, whom Steen, leading an IPW, an interrogation of prisoner of war team, interrogated. He also translated captured documents, meaning that he sometimes served at the front as an interrogator and sometimes in the rear at headquarters as a translator. He was attached with the 317th Infantry Regiment, which actually also overran Buchenwald. And Steen toured the camp and spoke with the remaining prisoners, taking this picture and writing this observation on the back of the photo. Promoted to staff sergeant, he continued to serve after the hostilities ended. He returned to his hometown of Frankfurt, and this is what he found: a city in ruins. But tourism wasn't his job. It was to investigate and arrest Nazis as the process of denazification began. Exactly what he did is unclear. There aren't any records in his in his archival collection, but this letter here gives you an idea. He was demobilized in December 1945, and that's where his military service ends. Now, at this point, I don't know much about Ernst's post-war life, other than he did return to Chicago, resumed work as a shoe salesman, married, had 2 children, yet there's still much research on him to be done. Now, I've introduced you to him to give you a sense of what I would put in air quotes, but call the average Ritchie boy. When he was doing basic training, he was interviewed about how he had evaded the Gestapo in 1938. And he told the journalist that he really wanted to return to Germany and that, quote, "I've got some targets already picked out there," unquote. Steen was a fighter, and I don't need to tell this to a community that knows about fighting Nazism. He was someone who fought to escape Germany, fought to get others out, fought for the chance to return to Europe, fought as an American serviceman, and was decorated for his efforts. And he continued to fight the remnants of Nazism in the immediate post-war period. This is typical of Ritchie boys, that they had motivations that any other American would have, but for them, the war was also raw and personal. It was a credit to those who actually designed and advised Camp Ritchie that collecting battlefield intelligence gave emigres like Steen, who knew the language, the terrain, the culture, and the customs of Germany, a way to contribute to the fight. Now, what else does the experience of Staff Sergeant Steen and the story of Camp Ritchie tell us? Well, historian Gary Gerstle argues that the myth of the heroic multi-ethnic platoon, first formed by Teddy Roosevelt and then forged in World War II, is perhaps the most significant and powerful nation-building narrative that we have. In many ways, Camp Ritchie was that American myth. It was a true cosmopolitan paradise. It even had good food. It was a place where people from different backgrounds largely unified in defense of the ideals that allowed them to share the same classrooms gathered. The Ritchie episode shows us that despite the racism, anti-Semitism, and other prejudices, rampant among pre-World War II Army Officer Corps, and despite the country's mistreatment of Japanese Americans and African Americans and others, elements within the Army perhaps reluctantly, and certainly haltingly, stumbled upon the benefits of diversity, particularly when tied to linguistic, cultural, and geographic knowledge. And by bringing attention to the contributions of these marginalized soldiers to the defense of America and to the shaping of post-war justice, by investigating in the unique struggles of these marginal, by investigating the unique struggles these marginal soldiers faced, we can be inspired by their grit, their intelligence, their persistence, and their patriotism. We can better understand how the Holocaust, systemic racism, and atrocity affected changing notions of Americanness and belonging, and played a critical role in the Army's history and its continued transformation. Now, that probably sounded like a conclusion, but I told you, I warned you, I have more. While Ernestine was in his 30s, most of the graduates of Camp Ritchie were younger. Many were the same age of some of my current students, the future leaders of our armed forces. And upon graduation, my students become the commanders of people like Ernestine. Like Steen, they're asked to understand the unthinkable. They will be the responders, the first responders to genocide. In fact, they already are. For example, they're currently the officers monitoring Ukraine, sharing intelligence, helping us devise our assistance plan, rooting out Russian mis and disinformation campaigns, protecting our cyber and actual infrastructure, and much more. And they're doing this related to a conflict that is exactly where the killing fields, where the Holocaust by bullets occurred during World War II. So as you reflect on Camp Ritchie and current genocides, think, of course, of the survivors, the victims, perpetrators, bystanders, and the rescuers, but reflect as well on the myriad of ways that the Holocaust is intertwined with American history. That includes our history of anti-Semitism and racism and general prejudice. It includes our Army history. And it also includes the long history of American justice, American diversity, and most importantly, American potential. Thank you very much for your time, for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Frey. So we are going to take questions both here on site as well as virtually from our at-home audience. We've got quite a sizable crowd watching virtually. So let's take our first question here.
Thank you very much. Not a question. I would like to introduce you to my uncle, who was a Ritchie boy.
I am
And if
happy
you
to
wouldn't-
do so.
If you wouldn't mind giving this to me. There. He passed away last year at the age of 97. And although he was a Ritchie boy, he never talked about it. So the question I have is, were they required to not talk about it until a certain period of time had elapsed? Unfortunately, I knew he was there. He told me he trained there, but I didn't know anything about what that meant. And he never told me.
Yes, so first off, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to talking further about one of the things that has been fantastic about my research. I was mentioning this to some of the Pfeffers earlier today, is I felt like I wish I discovered this 25 years ago. So yes, it has been a little longer than since I was age 8. It's one of those things that I had the same thing. I knew many people who were Ritchie boys, but they talked about that, yeah, they did some intelligence work. So I did not know the significance of this in 2010, and it really took until 2016 or so before I started realizing how important this was. And yes, there were limits on what people could say. Whenever the confidentiality or non-disclosure agreements basically are 50 years. And so it didn't mean you could talk after 50 years. It meant that you couldn't talk until that. Now, that didn't mean people didn't know about Camp Ritchie. The existence of the camp was public knowledge. That it was a military intelligence training camp was public knowledge. What exactly they did there was not. And so that kind of thing did not come out until the late 90s, early 2000s. similar to the experience of those who served in the Ghost Army. Right? Most of them were not allowed to talk, and that's the exhibit that you have here downstairs. They were not allowed to talk for the same period of time, essentially. So yes, we're only finding out about this, and 50 years is a long time, and often it means that we lose a lot of knowledge in the process, and it's sad and unfortunate, but that's why people like me try to be dogged and persistent and find out as much information as we can. And last year I was a fellow at the Holocaust Museum in DC, and I've been working with them since 2018 to try to get as many donations as possible of archival materials to them for preservation, for use by scholars. And happy to say we have about over 100 collections now. And some of them, I showed you one, for example, I gave you a quote from Walter Rothschild. That collection is amazing. I spent almost a month in it because it's about, I would say, in total, 3 different collections that are probably 5,000 or 6,000 pages. And some of them are just, it's amazing material. He wrote to his wife or his parents, sometimes more than once a day. And the family saved all those letters, and he saved some of the letters that his wife and his parents wrote to him. So it's an amazing collection. So you never know what's out there. And I've met some people who say, I think this is something useful, and my kids don't want it, or my grandkids don't want it. So can you take a look at it? And then to me, this is historian's gold. Right? You never know what you might find out. So tell everyone, don't throw it away until somebody looks at it. Right? And we're still looking to build the collection.
We'll take a question from our virtual audience from Irene and Brian Kaminer. I hope you're pronouncing your last name correctly. Do you have a list of graduates and when they graduated? I believe my father graduated in August 1942. I did not know until after he passed that he was a Ritchie boy.
That would have been very early, but it's very possible. And I did not create a list, but a man named Dan Gross, who describes himself as a Ritchie boy wannabe, created a database. And this was done over 15 years. Again, this is a labor of love. He's not a professional historian. He wasn't paid for this. He would go to the National Archives as a retired civil servant, and he would just go and collect as much as as much of the individual service records as he could. And some of this research is difficult because many of the personnel records that exist for the U.S. Army prior to 1950 burned in St. Louis. In the archive that existed in St. Louis, there was a fire in the early 70s, and the pre-50 records were in that archive. But the good thing about the Army and about bureaucracies is we don't just make one copy of things. And so you just have to be really persistent and dig in other places. You never know what you might find. So it's very possible. I'd love to talk to the cabinet.
Hi, this is more or less a follow-up to the other question. My father-in-law was a Ritchie boy, and though he passed away in 1978, so he never specifically said that, but we found records that indicated that he was. Is there a place we have a fair amount of his history at this point, both in oral history. He used to speak to me about it quite a bit, and we have photos and other documentation. Is there a place that I should be sending this?
So great question. I'm glad. It's almost like I planted these questions. Yes is the answer to that. And depending upon what you have, there are 2 different places. So I would say that the place where we're trying to consolidate these is the Holocaust Museum in DC. But there is now a new Fort Ritchie Museum, and I'm working with them, and other people are working with them. In terms of they're developing the storage capacity and to make sure that we are preserving these materials. We don't just want to turn them over. We want to make sure that they don't devolve and become things that we can't work with. But that museum has recently received a grant, and I'm actually happy to say that just on the 31st of the last month, a congressman, David Trone from Maryland, and the senator from Maryland, Ben Cardin, put forward a Congressional Gold Medal piece of legislation. So hopefully the Ritchie boys will be receiving that, similar to what was received by those in the Ghost Army. And so we're making progress. We have a place for these things. I'm working with that museum and the Holocaust Museum to put together an exhibit, a temporary exhibit that will be in the National Museum of the U.S. Army. And we hope then we'll be able to travel. So we're looking forward to those things. That sounds great.
My ex-father-in-law was a Ritchie boy, and actually 4 members of the family were Ritchie boys. So I had the know about them, but we never knew the story because he didn't talk about it. But I will say he was fluent in Dutch, Yiddish, German, English. That's what I know. And then he helped to liberate some of the camps. And that's where he met his wife. So he had a wife with the camp survivors. And then he continued in the reserves, in the Army Reserves. I remember him doing homework. He did intelligence homework, sitting at the kitchen table. So he did the 20 years of reserves. And he's now buried in Arlington Cemetery. And he also established the Jewish West Point.
Yeah.
And he was very proud to, we drove up there and we drove up there to, he was so proud of the chapter.
I'm someone who never loses an opportunity. I want to use, I know that both your tears are both of pride and I'm sure of loss, but what my job at West Point is not just to teach. I was talking to Jeff about this, that West Point's mission is to educate, train, and inspire our students. And this is one of the reasons that I'm so attracted to this particular story, is how inspirational it is. That to me, what many of these individuals overcame, what they did, the fact that it wasn't unusual to know 5 languages, that these are people that we need to look to as inspiration, as what we should want to be. And I think that stories like that, I'm very thankful that all of you who have family, and even if you don't, who have family that serve, this is why I teach, and what I try to inspire in my students is that there's a long legacy that they are inheriting, and this is an important part of it.
Yeah, as a somewhat ancient graduate of the West Point, I'm just curious about the center that you're a director of, because when I was there, that wasn't even on the radar, I don't think. So, and also I was a former military intelligence officer, but so I hopefully it's improving our reputation going forward. Hopefully
I didn't make any mistakes that you. Again, it's like I planted these questions. I'm very proud of having founded and convinced the Academy of the need for a Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. I made the argument that if we are not studying genocide and atrocity, mass atrocities as we call them, we are missing a large part of conflict, and that we need to understand this because most of the genocides and mass atrocities that occur in the course of some other ongoing conflict that we are consistently asked. Both the United States and specifically the Army and the Marines are often the first responders to these kinds of things. There are strategic implications to all of these atrocities that we have to consider, and if we're not, it's a massive blind spot. And I was able to convince the Academy of that of 2010 or so, and created this center that now supports 3 different courses. It supports trips, it supports conferences, it supports whole robust lecture series, films, exhibits, all kinds of things. I've taken cadets to South Africa, to Bosnia. We're going to Rwanda this summer. We've produced materials that actually are used in ROTC across the United States and also at the at higher levels of the Army professional military education system, and hopefully working to really build a cohorts of people who understand not just what these atrocities are, but how to think creatively about preventing them. And the Army is the institution, the armed forces are the institution that has more capability than any other institution in the world. Right? We have logistics, we have intelligence, we have things that no one else has, and we have the ability to both detect and warn and prevent, because they're way before we're getting to the point of talking about putting troops on the ground. When I initially proposed this, some of the pushback I got was, are you arguing that we should be solving everybody's problems? And my answer was, I'd like to, but I know that that's not going to happen. What I'm actually arguing for is I really like the students I teach. I don't want to see them in combat. I want them safe. I want us acting before we actually have to get to the point of thinking about what we call kinetic involvement, actual military involvement on the ground. And so if we are creative and if we are using our resources, we can warn, we can act, we can do things to prevent things from getting worse, to mitigate these things. And if you don't involve the military, then I don't remember exactly where it was, but it was somewhere right outside the never again in multiple languages out in the garden. I mean, that's a fool's dream if we're not incorporating the armed forces into that discussion.
Just want to say thank you. It's amazing. And as our grandparents would say in Yiddish, you're a mensch for doing all your research. Our grandfather, we found out in his papers that he was trained how to interrogate Nazi soldiers in Paris, France for like 2 weeks. Is that tied to what you did?
Possibly, right? So the Military Intelligence Training Center was not the only place where people were trained in military intelligence, but it was the primary one. And it's very possible. I showed you the example of the Americans dressed up in German uniforms, actually demonstrating German weapons. And it's very possible that Ritchie boys taught courses to your grandfather, because they did do a lot of this was preparation. One of the things that we sometimes forget is that the US Army went from about 200,000 people in 1939 to 8 million in a very short period of time. There was a lot of ad hoc work that was done. A lot of people had to just make things up on the fly. And so it's very possible that people did train as they were being shipped forward. And so that's very possible that in Paris he got training from Ritchie boys.
In the last year or 2 or 3, 60 Minutes has done 2 programs on the Ritchie boys. And what they did is they interviewed Ritchie boy survivors who are still active. They still have all their marbles, and they, like one, I don't remember their names, but one gentleman is a professor, I think, at Columbia. Do you work with them or correlate with them at all?
Now you're going to make me embarrassed, because I'm going to have to actually say that I was involved in that. And so, yes, it was. I was asked by once I gave another talk, and I was at a synagogue, and the rabbi asked, was it on your bucket list to be part of 60 Minutes? And I said, well, as long as I wasn't indicted. But I said, no, as a historian, you don't think of that. You think about the normal ways that you actually, normal in air quotes, ways of producing scholarship in books and articles. But now that it's happened, I highly recommend any historian doing something like that, because it has been the opportunity to meet families like you, to get people who now are writing me and are coming to me with their own family documents that are just helping to produce new scholarship. It's been amazing. And the fact that that 60 Minutes not only produced that, but then when they interviewed me, I gave them some names of additional people to talk to. And yes, I know Guy Stern. I've never been able to actually sit down with Victor Bromberg, but I recommended to them Max Lerner, who appeared in the longer version that they did. And it's been an incredible boon and a wonderful opportunity and a great chance to just meet more and more families. I've talked to at least 20, maybe 30 Ritchie boys, living Ritchie boys. And while we were losing them, unfortunately, as we were losing all survivors and World War II veterans, it's such a great privilege, especially when you hear, like, how can you not be inspired by Guy Stern? That he was the one in the 60 Minutes episode with the salmon jacket, and the one who still did, at the time at least, he still did exercises every morning. Unfortunately, he's not well right now, but he turned 100 this year. And how is that not someone who communicates to you the need to pass that inspiration on?
I've heard of Native Americans' code not being broken by the Germans. Is that how they were used in the Ritchie?
They weren't, right? They weren't. So that there's a separate kind of part of World War II history related to code breaker, or the code talkers, to Navajo code talkers and the other Native code talkers. But at Camp Ritchie, they weren't used for that purpose. They were actually, just as I mentioned, primarily the opposition force and support forces or support services at Camp Ritchie.
You might have hit the jackpot coming here to Skokie. So a lot of people online are asking for your contact information because they want to share with you their collection, their family photos of relatives who were part of the Ritchie boys. And a lot of people asking about recommended books or websites to learn more about the topic, and even finding out if a member of their family was a Ritchie boy. How can they find that out?
Super. So I mentioned, I didn't finish the answer, I guess, on the Dan Gross. So Dan Gross has actually created an online database, and you can look up the names of those who attended Camp Ritchie. And then I highly recommend my colleague Beverly Eddy's book, Ritchie Boy Secrets. That's the best book that is out there, and she's done some fantastic work. She also has given some talks about the Ritchie boys that are available online. She was on C-SPAN at one point, and so she's a linguist, and so she and I have slightly different approaches to the way we do some of our work, but it complements. We complement each other quite well, and I highly recommend her book, Ritchie Boy Secrets.
How can people get a hold of you?
Oh, yes. Well, luckily, I am the only David Frey at West Point that is a civilian. Okay, so there is a major David Frey. This has never happened to me before, but I am just david.frey at westpoint.edu. Very easy. So you just have to remember my name, spell with an E, F-R-E-Y, and you can get in touch with me that way.
I think I saw one more hand. We'll take one more final question.
Thank you so much. I'm sure most of us, at least, were horrified by some of the quotes from the pre-war army. And we all know that President Truman, of course, desegregated the military at the end of the 1940s. Did the army, did the military ever kind of formally confront and reject the views that had been manifest right up to the start of the war?
That's a really interesting question. So in policy, yes. And so when you desegregate, then the policy is no longer are we segregating, people are equal, right? But you can't change attitudes by fiat. And one of the things that I think is not known is that the Secretary of the Army at the time, or the Chief of Staff of the Army at the time, the military head of the Army, resigned when desegregation actually occurred. And so one of the projects that I'm working on is a kind of a longer history of isms within the armed forces, of extremism in particular of all types. And looking back at that, seeing what happens to these attitudes during after World War II. I don't think they just disappear. And it takes a long time, and we know it takes a long time because there are still issues of inequality. There are still issues of lack of opportunity for people who are a particular gender or a particular color. And it takes a long time to resolve those things, even if the policy is there. Sometimes the institutional inertia prevents those things from changing quickly. So that said, I'm very proud of the institution that I work for. I think we do a really good job. And in fact, I think we do a better job than American society in general. That doesn't mean that we're perfect. That doesn't mean that we don't have flaws that we need to address. But it does mean that that we're trying, and we continue to try. And that's part of the reason that I created a center, because as I sometimes pithily say, genocide is when societies decide that diversity is not a value, that homogeneity is more important than difference. And so in order to actually prevent genocide, you have to work to build understanding of difference and valuing of difference and incorporating it. And that's why I think this story about the failure of the Army to actually recognize the capacity that it was wasting by not actually fully employing and fully empowering African Americans, and keeping segregation of Japanese Americans, that weakens us. It didn't weaken us as much as it weakened the Nazis were no better, in fact, far worse about their ideas of the valuing of people and the differentiation between people. But for you to be strong, you have to actually recognize the capacities that the different people have and take advantage of those things.
Okay, a quick one. Is Camp Ritchie still in use?
It is not. It was one of the camps that was what was called BRACT. So when the base realignment happened in the early 2000s, it was closed. It was at last actually a friend of mine was the last commander there. And so for about 20 years, it was in disrepair, but it's been bought within the last few years by a developer. And that's part of the reason that there now is this Fort Ritchie Museum. Part of the agreement when they purchased that land was that they would create a museum for the camp. The camp began as it's named after a former governor of Maryland, and it began as a National Guard camp, and then was taken over by the Army in World War II and changed into the Military Intelligence Training Center. But it does have a long legacy. It's not far from those parts in the mountains where when let's put it this way, in the 1950s, we dug a lot of holes in those mountains in order to find places to put the federal government if big missiles were sent over. So there's a really interesting, just that area in and of itself is very interesting. And so it's not functional, but it is now being rejuvenated.
Thank you, Dr. Frey. It's always incredible, I think, to continue to learn, to be inspired by your remarkable research. Thank you so much for sharing the stories that you did. Incredibly inspiring. We joke about this, but we do this pretty much almost every Thursday and Sunday. So if you are not part of our mailing list, if you're not a member of the museum, please consider joining. This is just a really fantastic institution to be able to have these incredible programs and to learn together about, I think, kind of hidden histories that we don't often know about. Thank you again to the Pfeffer family for your continued support, and drive safe, everyone. Good night.
I'm going to be